All right, so I want to discuss about shares. So we have different class of shares in an organization. An organization can actually have different class of shares. So I want to discuss about these different types of shares. We have what are known as ordinary shares, and also we have preference shares. But we realize that these preference shares have different forms. So we are going to discuss about all the different forms of preference shares as well as the ordinary shares. So now we want to compare or to come up with the characteristics of ordinary shares and preference shares before we distinguish the different forms of preference shares that we have in an organization. So when you're looking at ordinary share capital, we are looking at shares which gives its holders the right to make decisions, which means ordinary shareholders have what we call voting rights. Ordinary shareholders have voting rights. Then also, when it comes to preference shareholders, the preference shareholders do not have voting rights. Preference shareholders do not have voting rights. Then now when you're looking at ordinary share capital, it is risk capital. So risk investors will go for ordinary equity or for equity capital because there are chances that you may lose everything at the end of the day. Unlike preference shareholders who are cautious investors because they are afraid to lose their investment. So we have ordinary shareholders who are risky capitalists, and we have preference shares or preference shareholders who are cautious investors because they are afraid to lose. Then also we realize that when it comes to preference shares, the preference shareholders have a preferential right to a return on capital if the company is wound up. They have a preferential right to a return on capital if the company is wound up, unlike ordinary share capital. There is no preferential right to a return on capital. That is, if the company is wound up. With preference shareholders, you realize also that they have preferential rights to a return on dividends. When it comes to dividends, they do have a preferential right to a dividend. Their dividend in most cases is fixed. That is for preference shareholders, unlike ordinary shareholders who doesn't have any preferential right to dividends, which means even if the company makes money, sometimes the directors of the company who have the prerogative to declare dividends may not declare interim dividends and may also not recommend final dividends. So that is another big difference between preference and ordinary shares. The issue when it comes to dividends, preference shareholders, you have a fixed rate or you have a preferential um, right to dividends, unlike ordinary shareholders. So those are the most important differences between the two class of shares that we need to understand. And also preference shares, they may be cumulative, which means that if you're a cumulative, if you are a preference shareholder, you may fail to receive a dividend in 1 year. Then when the company makes profits in future years, then you're entitled to get a return on such unclaimed dividends in previous years. So that is a benefit to a preference shareholder. The issue that such class of shares may be cumulative in nature. Failure to receive a dividend in 1 year, then you will be entitled to receive those dividends in future years. Unlike ordinary shareholders, they do not have that right to get dividends in future when they fail to receive in 1 year. previously or prior years. So that is one of the differences between preference shares and ordinary shares. So basically those are the difference. Voting rights, ordinary shareholders, no voting rights for preference shareholders, preferential rights to a dividend on preference shareholders, then also preferential right to a return on capital preference shareholders, then the ordinary shareholders is vice versa. There is no preferential right to a dividend and there is no preferential right to a return on capital if the company is wound up. Preference shares is for cautious investors. Ordinary share capital is for risk takers. So those are the main differences between equity capital and preference share capital. Now I want to look at the different forms of preference shares. We want to look at the different forms of preference shares. We have what are known as redeemable preference shares, and non-redeemable preference shares. So now we need to realize that when it comes to redeemable preference shares, these are shares that are issued to holders of preference shares at par or at a premium, and the company will redeem these shares at a stated date in the future. But we realize that it gives, redeemable preference shares gives a certain amount of protection to the investor. Why? Because you are guaranteed to get a fixed dividend and also the return on the amount of capital that you invested in the company. You're going to receive that principal amount in the future when the company redeems such class of shares. And most companies now, you need to realize that there will come issuance of redeemable preference shares. Why? Because the investor is not going to stay with the company forever. So that is the reason why companies are willing to issue redeemable preference shares. Why? Because the investor is not going to stay with the company forever. So that is an advantage to the company. Why? Because the burden of paying a fixed dividend will vanish away. So that is the reason why companies welcome issuance of such class of shares. Then also you need to realize that when these shares are redeemed, they can only be redeemed out of distributable profits available. We cannot redeem preference shares out of capital funds, but we can only do so out of retained profits. We can only do so out of retained profits. So those are what we call redeemable preference shares. Then the opposite is true. We have non-redeemable preference shares. So non-redeemable preference shares, in a way, are more like equity shares because the company cannot redeem such shares. The company cannot redeem such shares. So those are what we call non-redeemable preference shares. Those are what we call non-redeemable preference shares. Then we also have what are known as convertible preference shares. We have what are known as convertible preference shares. Convertible preference shares, the opposite of convertible is non-convertible preference shares. So when you are looking at this class of preference share, we realize that they can be converted into equity capital at a stated date in the future. They can be converted to equity capital at a stated date in the future. That is what we call convertible preference shares. So when you are looking at convertible preference shares, there is an advantage to the company when we convert these preference shares into equity, such that we are no longer entitled to pay a fixed dividend when we convert this class of preference share into equity. We are no longer burdened to pay a fixed dividend. So that is the advantage to the company. However, there is a disadvantage to existing shareholders because now there is dilution of share capital. Now there is dilution of share capital. But also, you need to realize that there is an advantage to the holders of these convertible preferences when we convert to equity. Now they also have voting rights. Now they also have voting rights, which is an advantage to um, those shareholders converted from preference shares to equity capital. Then when we are looking at the non-convertible preference shares, we cannot convert this class or form of preference share into equity capital. That is the reason why it is called non-convertible pref shares. The other form of preference share is what we call participative preference shares. Participative preference shares. So there is a benefit to holders of such class of preference shares because there is, or they are entitled to a double dividend because they get the fixed dividend. Then on top of the fixed dividend, also they participate with equity shareholders on any surplus profits made by the company. So that is the benefit of being a participative preference shareholder. You get a double dividend. The fixed dividend plus a share with equity shareholders on any surplus profits made by the company. Then the opposite is true. We call them non-participative preference shares, which means this class of preference shares is not entitled to a double dividend. So these are the different forms of preference shares that we have: redeemable and non-redeemable preference shares, convertible and non-convertible preference shares, participative and non-participative preference shares. So these are the different forms of preference share capital.